before the gods learned to rule, before thunder was crowned as law, before Olympus dared to call itself eternal, fear already existed. Not the fear of death, not the fear of pain, but something far older and far more profound. The fear that reality itself is unstable, that beneath the thin skin of order lies a truth too violent to endure. Greek mythology did not begin with heroes, nor with justice, nor with light. It began with wounds, with fractures, with beings so vast, so malformed, so hostile to balance, that the universe could only survive by naming them monsters and pretending they were exceptions. They were not. Monsters were not mistakes, they were evidence. The ancient Greeks did not imagine monsters as obstacles placed before heroes for entertainment. They imagined them as consequences of divine arrogance, of cosmic imbalance, of primordial violence that could never be fully erased. Every monster was born from a failure of harmony, a god's cruelty, a curse misjudged, a boundary violated, a power unleashed without restraint. These beings were reminders that creation was never clean, never moral, never finished. The world was not built once. It is being held together moment by moment against forces that remember what existed before gods claimed dominion. When the poets spoke of serpents large enough to crush mountains, of women whose gaze turned flesh to stone, of beasts stitched together from the nightmares of different ages, they were not asking their audience to be amazed. They were asking them to remember that order is borrowed, that law is fragile, that the gods themselves are standing on the corpses of older truths. Monsters are what happens when those truths refuse to stay buried. This is why the most terrifying monsters of Greek mythology are not terrifying because of how they kill, but because of what they reveal. They expose the lie that the cosmos is benevolent. They show that the gods are not guardians of goodness, but managers of catastrophe. And they whisper a warning that echoes through every myth. What was sealed away can return, what was defeated can endure, and what was born from violence will one day demand violence in return. This is not a story about bravery. It is not a story about triumph. It is a descent into the 10 most terrifying beings ever imagined by the Greek mind, not as curiosities, but as unavoidable truths. Because long before heroes raised swords, before gods raised temples, before mankind dared to believe the world was safe, the monsters were already waiting. And among them, one stands not merely as a creature, but as a reminder that the age of gods itself rests on a lie. Typhon was not born to rule, to punish, or to test heroes, but to end a mistake. And that mistake was the reign of the Olympian gods themselves. For he emerged not from chaos, but from outrage, conceived by Gaia after she watched her Titan children crushed, imprisoned, and erased by a younger generation that called its violence justice and its survival order. And in Typhon, the earth gathered every unspent fury of the primordial world into a single being whose very existence denied the permanence of Olympus, a creature so vast that language fractures when trying to contain him, described as having 100 serpentine heads rising from his shoulders, each one breathing fire, poison, storm, and disease. His arms stretching from horizon to horizon, his legs coiled as living vipers that crushed mountains beneath their weight. His voice, not a voice at all, but a chorus of animal roars, divine thunder, and human screams layered together into something that did not belong to any age the gods wished to preserve. And when Typhon rose, the gods did not stand and fight, as later myths would pretend they always did. They fled, abandoning the heavens, disguising themselves as animals, hiding among mortals, revealing in that moment that immortality does not erase fear, and that power collapses instantly when faced with something that does not seek dominance but annihilation. And when Zeus finally confronted him, it was not a heroic duel, but a catastrophe without moral weight. Mountains torn from the earth, like weapons, sky itself cracking beneath the pressure of divine violence. And at one point, Typhon defeated Zeus completely, ripping the sinews from his body and leaving the king of the gods broken and helpless. A detailed Greek myth preserved with chilling honesty, because it revealed a truth no temple inscription would ever confess, that the ruler of the cosmos could be undone. And though Zeus would eventually prevail through trickery, endurance, and overwhelming force, Typhon was not killed, only buried beneath the earth, imprisoned beneath a mountain, not as punishment, but as containment. And the Greeks believed that earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and violent storms were Typhon shifting beneath his prison, straining against the weight of the world placed upon him. For Typhon was never meant to be erased, only delayed. And that is why he is the most terrifying of all monsters, not because of his size or strength, but because his existence proves that the order of the gods is temporary, that the earth itself may one day rebel again, and that beneath every calm sky and stable law lies something older, angrier, and patient enough to wait for the moment when creation finally collapses under the violence that gave it birth. Medusa was not born a monster, and that is precisely why she is more terrifying than most, because her existence exposes the cruelty embedded within divine justice. For she began as a mortal woman whose beauty drew the attention of a god, and when that god violated her within a sacred space, the punishment did not fall upon the violator, but upon the violated, transforming Medusa into a living curse whose gaze turned flesh to stone, a power that was not a weapon she chose, but a sentence imposed upon her, ensuring that she could never again be approached, loved, or even looked upon without destruction. And in this transformation, Greek myth reveals a chilling truth about power, that the gods preserve order, not by correcting injustice, but by silencing its evidence. For Medusa's monstrous form ensured that her story would be feared rather than heard, her isolation absolute, her existence reduced to a warning rather than a tragedy. And the terror of Medusa does not lie in her serpents or her deadly eyes, but in the psychological horror she embodies, the fear of being seen, the fear of visibility itself becoming fatal, the fear that suffering can be weaponized against the sufferer. And when Perseus eventually beheaded her, aided by divine gifts and careful to avoid her gaze, her death was not framed as justice but as necessity, because monsters born from injustice are never redeemed, only removed. And even in death, Medusa remained dangerous, her severed head retaining its power, used as a tool by gods and heroes alike, a reminder that once violence has been made sacred, it does not end, it only changes hands. And Medusa endures as one of the most terrifying figures in Greek mythology, not because she kills, but because she proves that innocence offers no protection in a world governed by gods who confuse authority with morality. Echidna, the mother of monsters, represents a terror that is slow, generational, and impossible to eradicate, for she was neither fully divine nor fully bestial, dwelling at the margins of the world where civilization dissolved into wilderness, a liminal being whose power did not manifest through conquest but through birth, for from her body came some of the most infamous horrors of Greek myth, including Cerberus, the Hydra, the Chimera, and countless others. And in Echidna, Greek mythology confronts a fear deeper than any single beast. The fear that monstrosity reproduces, that it adapts, that even when one horror is slain, another will rise in its place, shaped by the same primordial source. And unlike Typhon, Echidna was not imprisoned or destroyed. She was allowed to exist, tolerated by the gods, because her offspring served a purpose, testing heroes, enforcing boundaries, populating the world with threats that justified divine intervention. And this is what makes her terrifying, that she was integrated into the cosmic order, her existence sanctioned, her womb a factory of terror that ensured the world would never be safe. And through Echidna, the Greeks acknowledged that chaos is not always opposed by order. Sometimes it is managed, cultivated, and unleashed when convenient, making her not a mistake but a feature of reality itself. The Hydra embodies the terror of problems that grow when confronted directly, a creature whose very anatomy punished aggression, for each head severed only gave rise to two more, ensuring that violence multiplied rather than resolved the threat. And beneath this physical and philosophical one, the idea that some evils cannot be defeated through force, that effort itself can worsen the situation, that struggle can be self-defeating. And the Hydra's poison, so potent that even its blood and breath carried death, ensured that victory always came at a cost. For even Hercules, the greatest of heroes, required assistance and strategy to overcome it, cauterizing wounds to prevent regeneration, a symbolic act, suggesting that only by sealing violence with restraint can chaos be contained. And even then, the Hydra's essence endured, its venom later used as a weapon, reinforcing the unsettling truth that destruction leaves residues, that solutions born from violence carry consequences forward. And the Hydra terrifies not because it is unbeatable, but because it teaches that some horrors are sustained by the very methods used to destroy them. Cerberus, the hound of the underworld, is terrifying not for what he does, but for what he represents. A living boundary between life and death, whose monstrous form ensured that the dead remained where they belonged, and the living never crossed without consequence, a creature with multiple heads, serpents entwined around his body, and a gaze that promised no negotiation. And unlike other monsters, Cerberus was never meant to be slain, only avoided, subdued, or respected, because his role was essential to the structure of reality itself, guarding the finality of death. And in Cerberus, Greek mythology reveals a profound existential fear that death is not an enemy to be defeated, but a border that must not be violated, and that those who attempt to escape it, whether heroes or gods, do so at the risk of unraveling the cosmic order, making Cerberus terrifying not as a beast, but as the embodiment of inevitability. The Chimera is terrifying because it is wrong, a creature composed of mismatched parts, lion, goat, serpent, stitched together into a single fire-breathing abomination that defied natural categorization. And in this unnatural fusion, Greek myth expressed a deep discomfort with boundary violations, with things that should not coexist being forced together. And the Chimera's destruction did not restore balance so much as eliminate an error, reinforcing the idea that the world is fragile, easily warped, and reliant on constant correction. And the terror of the Chimera lies in the implication that monstrosity can be engineered, that horrors can be assembled deliberately rather than born, a fear that resonates with any civilization aware of its own capacity to create what it cannot control. Scylla represents the terror of unavoidable loss, a monster positioned deliberately in a narrow passage where sailors were forced to choose between destruction and sacrifice. And no matter the decision, death was guaranteed. For Scylla did not annihilate entire ships, but snatched individuals one by one, ensuring survival came at the cost of grief. And her existence reflects a cruel truth embedded in Greek mythology, that some journeys demand payment, that survival is not free, and that leadership often involves choosing who will be lost. And Scylla's horror is psychological rather than physical. The knowledge that no skill, no bravery, no divine favour can pass through certain moments without blood. Charybdis, the devouring whirlpool, embodies the terror of annihilation without intention, a force of nature rather than a conscious predator, consuming ships not out of malice but inevitability. And paired with Scylla, she completes a nightmare geography where every path leads to destruction, reinforcing the mythological understanding that the world itself can be hostile, that danger does not always wear a face, and that some deaths are simply the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, swallowed by forces too vast to comprehend or resist. The Minotaur is terrifying because it is the product of human arrogance and divine punishment intersecting, a creature born from deception, desire, and political pride, imprisoned in a labyrinth not to protect the world from it, but to hide the shame of its existence, and fed with human lives to maintain the illusion of order. And the Minotaur's true horror lies in its confinement, a being that did not choose monstrosity, but was forced to live and die within it, making it both victim and threat, a reminder that civilizations often create the monsters they later pretend to heroically destroy. Finally, the giants, the gigantes, are terrifying, not as individuals, but as a collective memory of rebellion, born from the blood of a mutilated sky god and forever opposed to Olympus, representing the fear that power seized through violence will always be challenged by those it crushed. And their war against the gods was not about domination but vengeance, an echo of unresolved injustice that resurfaced in the form of war. And though they were defeated, their myth served as a warning that order founded on blood never truly stabilizes. It merely postpones retaliation, making the giants terrifying as the shadow of history itself, the certainty that what is buried is never truly gone. And so the monsters do not end when the stories end, because they were never meant to be defeated, only understood. For Greek mythology does not use monsters to reassure, but to warn, to remind those who listen that the world was not made gently and will not be preserved kindly, that every god who claims dominion stands upon older bones, and every law that promises stability is written against forces that remember a time before it existed. When the Greeks spoke of Typhon shifting beneath the earth, of Medusa's gaze lingering even in death, of boundaries guarded by beasts that could not be slain. They were not indulging in fantasy, but acknowledging a truth their civilization dared not ignore, that violence is the engine of creation and the shadow of its future, and that order survives not because chaos is gone, but because it is restrained, managed, buried beneath rituals, walls, and stories. And yet always present, waiting. And this is why monsters endure long after heroes fade. Because heroes exist to reassure the living, but monsters exist to remind them that the cosmos is not moral, that justice is negotiated by power, that the gods themselves are temporary solutions to eternal problems, and that what was born from blood, betrayal, and force will one day return to them in the same language. For in Greek mythology, the end is not a failure, but a completion, the moment when everything suppressed demands recognition once more. And when the walls finally crack, the gods fall silent, and the world returns to the truth it tried so desperately to forget. The monsters will not arrive as invaders, but as witnesses, because they were always there, woven into the foundation of reality, waiting for the inevitable moment when creation remembers how it began.